Trophies of Empire, which was in 1992 and then going into 1993, began, goes back to Black Skin Bluecoat really. We'd kept up the dialogue with Keith, and he came to see us and said, I've got this great idea for a show of my own work called Trade Winds, which is looking at the legacies of slavery in Liverpool, which was so involved and so important to that trade. It became the largest slave port in the UK and globally. In fact, it was hugely profitable, and it's actually what built this town, was built on slavery. And we said, well, okay, that sounds, let's do it. What's the sort of context? And Keith reminded us that coming up in 1992 was the Columbus quincentenary, 500 years since Columbus's so-called discovery of the Americas. And that seemed a really good backdrop, and we had time to pull it together. At the same time, we were talking to other venues, the Arnold Feeney particularly. They wanted to work with Keith as well. And also, we had a very good relationship with Mike Stubbs over in Hull, who was running Hull Time-Based Arts, which was an agency for new live art practice, performance art. And they were very interested in marking this anniversary in some way. And there was a counter campaign called 500 Years of Resistance, because there was a hell of a lot of hoo-ha about, we've got a lot to celebrate, this is the birth of modern America and all this stuff. And as we all know, it was an illusion and a lie. So the campaign against the Columbus quincentenary was very sort of active in Liverpool particularly. So we linked to that, and then importantly, because we felt it was a much bigger opportunity than just showing Keith's work, which would have been in itself would have been very interesting. We felt we should open it out to other artists. So the Arnold Feeney, the Bluecoat, and Hull Time-Based Arts, working with the Ferrens Art Gallery in Hull, collaborated on an open competition for other artists to put in proposals in how you interrogate the legacies in those three places particularly, but in Britain generally, to Columbus's discovery, what that led to in terms of colonialism, of British imperial expansion and so on. And we decided to call the show, I think it was Keith came up with the idea of Trophies of Empire. It wasn't his title, it had existed before in another piece of work by another artist. It's a phrase that I suspect existed even before that. But it seemed to be a very potent, ironic title that we could take. Trophies of Empire, what are the legacies of British Empire? At a time when people weren't really talking about it, it was like, that's all forgotten, that's all in the past. And yet for artists like Keith, this was really part of his legacy, his personal legacy as somebody coming, whose parents came from the Caribbean and settled in this country. And that's how it began, really, as an idea from Keith. We then got some money to do a bit of research, and Keith was paid with Janice Cheddy and a guy called Abdullah Badwi, who was a local guy is a photographer who worked for the city council. And the three of them did some research into the actual facts of the slave trade. So the artists had actually information if they wanted to make works explicitly about that. And they didn't all. The work was all about many different things relating to the legacies of colonialism and imperialism. But what made it more current, I suppose, was that 1992 was also going to be the year of the Maastricht Treaty, which was the unification of Europe. So we had the common market, but this was creating the EEC, the European Union, and it was the beginning of what became the single currency, the euro. So all that process was happening then, and there was concerns in this country of what that would mean for us, as there is today at the moment in terms of the debates around Europe, but also about the connections that Britain had with its ex-colonies would in fact be broken by this new economic confederation, if you want to call it that, of Europe. So it was bringing together a 500-year-old story of colonial exploitation and the current way that we seem to be going in terms of joining this new pan-European money-driven thing called Europe. So it all sort of came together. So it was about the past, but it was also very much about the present and where diverse communities that happen to be in Europe as a result of colonialism, where they stood and what their concerns were and what their histories were. So it was a very rich story to engage with, and we got some fantastic applications, as you can imagine. And by this time, you know, so if we go back to Black Skin Bluecoat, was 7 years before that, was 6 or 7 years before that. You know, people like Keith's work had become more sophisticated in terms of he was using video by this time, whereas the early stuff was slide tapes, and which always used to break down, you know, slide projectors and tape machines. And actually the videos used to break down as well, but not as much. And it was just great to see what artists were doing, and people like Donald Rodney were in the show, and Jaginda Lamba, the sculptor, Rita Keegan. It was a real mixed bag of everything from conventional painting to wood carving to, you know, the most up-to-date video art, and very, very powerful. And it was what made it interesting, I think, and different, was that it was spread across 3 cities and different venues in those cities, and it expanded beyond the gallery to performance work. There was a lot of relationships between the work in Trophies of Empire, but also between the venues. And that was quite a challenge, deciding on what we wanted in which venue. Now, some artists applied specifically for a space. So if you look at someone like Paul Clarkson, who was a young graduate from Liverpool, who had just finished at Preston. He's a painter, and he was a young black Liverpool artist, and his work had to be here because it was about interrogating his own history and the history of slavery in this city. It would have made less sense in other venues. Other artists, their work was talking more general terms about those legacies, and it could have happened anywhere. And in fact, some artists showed at the three different cities, but Keith's work had to be here in Liverpool because it was about slavery. But it also had to be in Bristol because it was about Bristol's part in the slave trade as well. And we put that in another venue, which was the Maritime Museum, which is not too far away from here, and that's in the dock area of the city. And it made absolute sense to put it in the Maritime Museum, in a former dock, the largest dock warehouse in Europe. I think it's massive, and all the history that's still within those the bricks of that building. And it was an institution, the Maritime Museum, which at that time had barely acknowledged slavery at all. So the whole museum, I think it was one panel mentioned it. And this was about 2 or 3 years before the Slavery Museum opened there. So it was really important that show was in that space. So context was everything. And in this city, we had Keith's work at the Maritime Museum. We had Jaginda Lamba, who made a really beautiful wooden sculpture, like an assemblage of old timbers, some of which he claimed had come from slave ships and so on, and carvings. And that was in the garden here, but also it was shown in Hull at Wilberforce House. Now, Wilberforce was the MP who's credited with being the architect of abolition. I mean, some people contest that, the degree to which he was and his motives. But it's true, he was the MP for Hull, and he was the person that led the campaign against to abolish slavery. So to have that piece shown in here, and this building, of course, was built from the profits of slavery. It was built in 1717, the time when the port was expanding and people were making huge fortunes out of the slave trade. And a lot of the money that came in here through subscriptions was from families that were either involved in slave trade directly or allied industries, cotton, tobacco, sugar, etc. So to have a piece of work that is very explicitly about freedom and emancipation in a venue that has that history, and then to also show it in another venue in Hull, which was Wilberforce's house where he used to live, had these great historical resonances, and it just seemed to work. So we were very conscious of where we placed work relating to the context of the venue, and the work in relation to each other as well. So I think we had, five works here, something like 5 or 6. And they sort of fed off each other because the narrative, even though Rita Keegan's work, for instance, was about her family, whose great-great-grandmother, I think, was a slave who married a white man, and she's from New York. and for her to come to Liverpool and then to trace her heritage through slavery to Liverpool and do an installation in this venue had a real resonance. And you got that next to someone like Sunil Gupta, whose work was about the Goa in India, and it was about how what was a Portuguese colony, the colonialisation continues through tourism. So you get these very different experiences of diaspora artists, I suppose, and seeing where their journeys had come from, whether it was from, Goa in India or the Caribbean or New York or wherever. At the end of the exhibition in the three cities, we felt it was important to document what had happened and to contextualise it a bit. So we had a bit of money left over, and we invited Ghislaine Tawdros, who went on to become the first director of Innova. She provides the keynote essay for this, which is called Sweet Oblivion, and it's a really beautiful text that really sets the work in the historical context of empire. And again, I mentioned the word amnesia before, but the fact that memory is like sugar disappearing into a cup of tea, that it just disappears and evaporates, and it gives a sweet taste. And her point was that our memory, the public memory and the public consciousness of all that is that it's very sweet, and wasn't it great in the days of empire, but actually the reality was very bitter. These are bitter taste. Keith's essay, which is really his research, is about slavery, is also in here. And then we invited artists to write about their own work, say a few things, and we showed documentation of the different work in the different cities. I wanted to particularly talk about this work here by three white British artists living in Liverpool and Manchester who were graphic designers, essentially. And they applied with this idea called the trophy cabinet. And they wanted to have a cabinet full of these commodities, which were the commodities that you associate with the slave trade. So it's sugar, tea, and tobacco. And I've got examples here. This was the pack of tea. You can see that, the pot of gold, as it was called. And that's the packaging was really, really beautifully done. Okay, so you get a real sense of the packaging there. I'm just going to open it up because this hasn't got tea in it, but it has got a set of postcards, because tea cards, if you want to call them that. But every pack of tea, tobacco and sugar had within it a free card. I don't know whether they still do it, but you used to get tea and cigarettes had cards that you collected. And these were the little cards inside. You can see these cards here. Very beautifully illustrated, and it told us really the history of slavery, of colonialism, of the resistance to colonialism, and it comes right up to date, and it talks about Europe, what was about to happen in Europe. And on the back of these cards, you had the history. So that would tell you about that particular image. But you'd collect all these things, and then you'd eventually put them in an album, which looked like this, the Trophies of Empire picture card album, and the cards would be sort of stuck in there. Like so, stuck in like that. But I wanted to show you that, and I must just show you the pack of sugar, which is called blood sugar cubes. And again, I'll just show you how the packaging looks. The different sides of it. Okay, and then inside, there you go. There's the sugar. After all these years, is still there, and the cards that you'd get with it. And that piece of work, because it was a multiple piece. It was shown in each venue, so it was in Bristol, Liverpool, and Hull. And you could buy these things. They're very inexpensive to buy. A packet of sugar. I don't know if anyone's got any anymore, but we've certainly got some in our archive. And the whole collection is shortly going to become part of the Liverpool International Slavery Museum collection. I suppose the audience reaction to trophies was it was more a bigger audience, because by that time we'd developed more of an audience for this sort of work, but also it was quite a high-profile exhibition for us. These were newly commissioned works. It was part of a project that was happening in Bristol and Hull as well. And it was set against this context of the Columbus quincentenary, particularly, less so the Maastricht Treaty, which came a little bit later, but it was it had much more potency because it was commissioned in relation to what was happening in the world in geopolitical terms right then, whereas the Blackskin Bluecoat, I suppose, was our initiation into it. It was the first time we'd showed that sort of work. So I suppose it was a bigger audience. The reaction, I'd have to look back through the visitor's book and so on to see, but I vaguely remember, anecdotally, it was very positive. Not universally so, and we had, again, back to the issue we talked about in terms of a local black audience for Blackskin Bluecoat, there was some negative responses, particularly to the material we'd just seen from South Atlantic Souvenirs, or the Donald Rodney work, which was not here, but it was in Bristol, but we had images of it. Both of them were playing with irony in a very, very sophisticated way. And we did a workshop with some kids from a local black youth project who were very aggressive and said, we think you're taking the piss. This is, how can you trivialise this? Because they're very sophisticated in their own thinking. They knew about empire, they knew about colonialism, they knew about racism from a daily basis, obviously. But they felt that the work was almost like triumphant about empire, because it wasn't. It was very much a critique of empire. But for some young people, they found it wasn't explicit enough. It was just too subtle, particularly the material I've just shown you, the cards, the sugar, the tobacco. They felt that was very much demeaning the whole process of the slave trade. So that was quite interesting, again, unexpected, because you think you're going to do this work and everyone's going to say, yeah, it's great, it's very right on, very political, but actually it doesn't always work like that. And that has been one of the things which has been really interesting about showing this work in a public context, because it's not, mainly it's work that's quite underground, it's not part of a mainstream, and artists, inevitably are going to be a bit ahead of the game in terms of the way they present this work, and the messages and the way they actually create the work can be very subtle, and they play around with stereotypes of black people. So Donald Rodney's work, which wasn't here, was very provocative. It was a series of sporting trophies which you could buy in a trophy shop for boxing or golf or whatever, and he put on it the little plaques with very negative stereotypes about black people, like black men are good at sport, black men are liars, etc. And a lot of people felt that was very insulting. I recall that the problem that we have being not in London is that you don't get the main press, you don't get the Sundays, they didn't come. But we had a very, very positive piece in Third Text by Sean Cubitt. Again, that's very specialist. Not many people would have seen that outside of a very small readership. But over time, those reviews start to get circulated, and they become very important documents of what, at a sort of intellectual level, what critics were thinking about the show. It certainly didn't fit the pattern of what a black art show should be, because it wasn't exclusively artists of colour. Because it took a more subtle approach to a political or a cultural sort of moment in terms of Europe and America, it perhaps didn't really fit the bill. And I think it was certainly from our perspective, it had an impact here because it tapped into a local discourse around the legacies of the slave trade. But beyond that, I don't know whether it did really have that impact. Certainly not in terms of art history. I mean, it's partly what the Black Artists and Modernism project's about, is actually looking at the work in the context of modernism or postmodernism, whatever you want to call it, but as art. And many of these exhibitions would be seen as part of a political or a cultural agenda, not one about the history of art. So, that didn't never bothered me. I didn't bother the artists that they were part of art history. You can't be part of art history until history's written. It's not written at the time.